Welcome to part 7 of Buddhism. This is about Theravada Buddhism, one of the main branches of Buddhism that's prominent in South and Southeast Asia. Here's a map of the main types of Buddhism. Theravada is shown in red. You can see it's the main type of Buddhism in the modern nations of Burma or Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Sri Lanka. Mahayana Buddhism in yellow is the main form of Buddhism in East Asia, including Vietnam, China, Korea, Japan. And Vajrayana Buddhism, shown in orange, is prominent in Central Asia, such as in Mongolia, parts of Russia, Tuva and Kalmykia, parts of China, such as Tibet, and the nations of Nepal and Bhutan. So we're going to focus on Theravada Buddhism in this presentation. Theravada Buddhism means doctrine or teaching of the elders, and it's often regarded as the successor of Theravada. So Theravada is one of the branches of Buddhism that emerged after the Second Council, when there was a schism between the Mahasanghikas and the Theravadins. One of the things that Theravada has in common with Theravada is the teaching that only monks can become fully awakened, and this follows what the Buddha had taught in the Pali Canon. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that this is almost a kind of technical point of dispute between Theravada and other forms of Buddhism, because the usual view is that awakening, or full enlightenment, is very rare, whether for monks or for lay people or for any type of being. And so it's almost like an academic point, whether it's only monks can become fully awakened or if lay people have that capability too. Nevertheless, it was an important point of dispute between some of the different schools of Buddhism, and the ones that allow for lay people to become awakened, such as Mahayana, they tend to look more favorably too upon lay people trying to practice meditation and other parts of the path that are more commonly reserved for monks. So some of the differences between Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism is that in Theravada, the emphasis is on worshiping the Buddha himself, which is called Buddha Puja. They do believe that there are other Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, or beings who are basically on the quest to become a Buddha. These are things that are believed in by Theravada Buddhism, but the main focus of the religion is on worshiping the Buddha who founded the religion historically, Siddhartha Gautama, or Shakyamuni Buddha, as he's also called. And also in Theravada Buddhism, they say that arhants, or saints, these are people who became awakened as the result of following the teachings of the Buddha. Their enlightenment is regarded as having the same quality. It's just as perfect or complete as the enlightenment of a Buddha. And so becoming an arhant is regarded as a perfectly worthy and noble goal. This is something that is different from Mahayana, in which it's more valued to try to become a Buddha yourself by following what's known as the Bodhisattva path. Another point of distinction between Theravada and other forms of Buddhism is their Abhidharma. So the different schools of Buddhism, or the different branches, I should say, Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana, they have some scriptures in common. So essentially, Theravada, the Sutra Pitaka of the Pali Canon, and the Vinaya Pitaka is quite close to what they have in Sanskrit, Chinese, Tibetan. Those are the main languages of Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism. Mahayana and Vajrayana add their own additional sutras and texts as well. One of the other differences in terms of their scriptures is their Abhidharma Pitaka of the canon. So in the Pali Canon, which is used by Theravada Buddhists as their scriptures, their Abhidharma teaches what is called an atomistic metaphysics. So this means that the ultimate reality are composed of little point particles, you could think of them as, similar to the modern view of atoms or subatomic particles being the ultimate constituents of reality. The difference is that in the Theravada Abhidharma, these particles, they only last for a short amount of time, like a fraction of a second. So a better analogy might be to the pixels that appear on a screen to present an image. Each pixel is its own color and its own location, and it only lasts for a small amount of time. So that's similar to the Theravada view of reality. It's this kind of pixelated view of things. And they also believe that if you perfect your awareness through meditation, you can actually see these fundamental space-time constituents or atoms of being. Regardless of the details, this is one of the ways in which Theravada teaching is distinct from other forms of Buddhism. So an early important figure in Theravada Buddhism is the scholar monk Buddhaghosa. He wrote what's called the Visuddhimagga, which is a summary of the Buddhist path to nirvana. Now, on the one hand, the path to nirvana is completely detailed by the Buddha in the Pali Canon, and those are the main teachings followed by Theravada Buddhism. But the Pali Canon is actually structured around the biography of the Buddha, in part. Each one of the sutras is really something the Buddha said at a particular time in his life to a particular audience. And these different sutras or talks of the Buddha are not organized chronologically within the Pali Canon. They're organized on different principles, such as the longer ones are one basket or collection of texts. Then there's the middle-length ones that are another collection of texts. And there's even a collection of texts in the Sutra Pitaka of the Pali Canon that are arranged numerically by the list of things that they number and how many, what the number of things are in the list of that particular sutra. The point is, these are not really arranged either chronologically or according to any other systematic method, whereas the Visuddhimagga is a systematic expression of the teachings of the Buddha as they were understood by early Theravada monks. Buddhaghosa is also famous for a biography of the Buddha that is the main one used by Theravada Buddhists to understand the events in his life. And as I mentioned in the previous presentation, these include some legendary accounts as well as some that are probably historical. You can see in the picture on the right side of the slide some modern Theravada Buddhists paying their respects to monks. So the monks on the right, in response to offerings by the lay people, may say prayers, do chants in Pali, or give them blessings. You can also see that there are images of the Buddha in the background. It's most common in Theravada Buddhist temples to see images of Shakyamuni Buddha or Siddhartha Gautama as opposed to other Buddhas or Bodhisattvas. So in order to distinguish Theravada between other types of Buddhism, I introduced this notion of the Arhat. This is a type of awakened being in Buddhism, but there's actually three main types of awakened beings: Samyak Sambuddha, Pratyeka Buddha, and Arhat. A Samyak Sambuddha, this means a complete Buddha. This is what corresponds to the type of being that Siddhartha Gautama is. A Samyak Sambuddha is a being who discovers the path to awakening and then teaches the Dharma, teaches that path to a whole world or universe of beings out of compassion for their suffering. The Buddhists believe that the founder of the religion was not actually the originator of the Dharma. The Dharma is a kind of timeless principle. There were Buddhas before Siddhartha Gautama, and there will be Buddhas after as well. The role of the Samyak Sambuddha is to be incarnated at a world, in a place and in a time in which the Dharma is no longer understood or it's been completely forgotten about. And then this being, as a Samyak Sambuddha, will reintroduce the Dharma to that world. And they're believed to perform a very important role because without them, no one in that world would know the path to nirvana. A bodhisattva is someone who plans to become a Samyak Sambuddha in some future birth. And the idea is they could attain awakening sooner, possibly, by becoming an Arhat, following the teachings of an earlier Buddha. Instead, they deliberately delay their awakening and reincarnate into different bodies and different worlds, biding their time until they can be reborn in a time and place in samsara that has forgotten about the Dharma, and they can become a Samyak Sambuddha. The second type of awakened being is called a Pratyeka Buddha. This means a private Buddha. This is a being who does discover the path to awakening on their own, but either because they're not in the right circumstance or because of some other factor, they don't teach the Dharma and introduce it to a whole world of beings. So Buddhists do believe there are these private Buddhas out there as well that perhaps no one has ever heard of. They just weren't able or decided not to teach the Dharma to their world. And then there's Arhants. So in Theravada Buddhism, becoming an Arhant is regarded as a perfectly worthy and noble goal. This is someone who has attained awakening by following the teaching of a Samyak Sambuddha. They're more prominent in Theravada Buddhism, worshipping and respecting Arhants, whereas in Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism, it's more common to honor or worship a complete Buddha or a Bodhisattva. However, even within Mahayana Buddhism, it is possible to see veneration of Arhants, as you can see from this Chinese icon of an Arhant on the right, and that would be an icon used by Mahayana Buddhists in China. So one of the most important Theravada countries is Sri Lanka. So the history of Buddhism in Sri Lanka is that it came there during the reign of Ashoka the Great. Ashoka the Great had many sons. One of his sons was named Mahinda. Mahinda was a Buddhist monk, and Mahinda was sent to bring the religion to Sri Lanka. And Theravada Buddhism took root there and became the most important or the most prevalent religion. Sri Lanka is also the first place where the Pali Canon was written down. For several centuries, the texts of the canon were preserved through oral transmission, much like the Hindu Veda in its early history. However, there was a time in Sri Lanka in which the number of monks dwindled due to basically a kind of calamity or disaster. And during this time, there were a very small number of monks who actually knew all the texts and were able to transmit it to other people. And so it was realized that it'd be safer and more secure to write down the scriptures to help preserve them for later generations. And so this was first done in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was also very important for the spread of Theravada Buddhism to Southeast Asia. Now, basically, in the Middle Ages, you might say, so starting in the first few centuries CE or AD, and continuing up until around 1000 or so CE, Buddhism did exist in Southeast Asia, but it was in multiple forms. There was both Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism, and there were also Hindus and other religions there. But it was partially the result of missions of monks going from Sri Lanka to Southeast Asia that Theravada Buddhism became the prominent religion there. Sri Lankan Buddhism is also known for the Temple of the Tooth, which holds a sacred relic believed to be the Buddha's tooth. And this illustrates that in Buddhism, there is a veneration of relics. It's believed that you can basically have a form of good karma by paying your respects to the mortal remains of a Buddha or other awakened being. There is an annual festival in Sri Lanka called the Perahera Festival, which basically means the Festival of the Tooth. And the tooth is actually paraded along on the back of an elephant through the streets, and a lot of Buddhists gather there to pay their respects. I've read actually that they don't put the actual relic anymore on the elephant's back just for safety, but that's the sort of custom and the tradition anyway. So I mentioned that Theravada Buddhism is the main religion of Southeast Asia, and what was going on is that early in the history of Southeast Asia, they were very much influenced by ancient India. The kingdoms of India were older, they were more powerful and prosperous than those of Southeast Asia. So when the kings of Southeast Asia emerged, they kind of modeled themselves after what they observed happening in India. And also there were contacts of trade that brought Hinduism and Buddhism from India to Southeast Asia. Starting around the 11th century CE, Theravada Buddhism became the dominant form of Buddhism and the dominant religion there. The kings of Southeast Asia, such as the kings of Thailand, became regarded as protectors of Buddhism. So they became kind of incorporated into the Buddhist religion. Paying your respects to the king could be indirectly a way of paying your respects to the religion. If you go to a Thai Buddhist temple, you might see pictures or sculptures of the current or previous king of Thailand in the Buddhist temple. And that shows you there's still a kind of association there between the monarchy and Buddhism. This is kind of following the tradition that there are these Chakravartins or wheel-turning kings who help restore and promote the Dharma in the world. That's an idealized version of how the kings of Thailand and the other traditional monarchies of Southeast Asia saw themselves.